at this point, our app component is looking pretty good. So the next thing that I want to do is to write a test for it using Jest and React testing library. This is the combination of tools that we used in previous sections to write our component tests, and we're going to do the same thing here. But before we get to writing the tests for the app component, there is an important bit of Jest functionality that I would like to introduce you to, because it is going to be necessary in order for us to write the test for our app component. And that functionality is called Jest mock functions. So we do need to be within the Jest ecosystem in order for our code to work. And all that means is we have to write the following code in a .test.js file, because those are the files that Jest will look for when we run it from the command line. So luckily, we already have a sample test file within our project. In source, we have app.test.js. So let's use this one for now. And after we write the code in this lesson, later on in the next lesson, we'll simply replace the existing code with an actual test for the app component in this file. For now, we can remove all the code that is presently in here. This was just the starter code left for us by the Create React App team for the original version of the app component, so it's no longer relevant. And here we can write our regular Jest code. So as a reminder, we can start out with a top-level describe function. That is sort of like the header for the collection of tests that we're about to write. So here I'm going to describe the component that we are testing, which is app. And then I provide a second argument of an arrow function to my describe function. Then within the body of the arrow function, I can write my tests. I can write tests in one of two ways. I can either write an it function call like so, or a test function call. And these two are identical. They're actually the same function under the hood. They are aliases, or in other words, alternate names for each other. They are the same thing. So you are welcome to use whichever option you like. I tend to prefer it because that reads more like a sentence to me. And so right here, the first argument to it is a string describing the test or the functionality that you are testing. Right now, we're not actually going to be testing the app component, so it doesn't really matter what we put here. So I'm just going to literally write the string, doesn't matter. And that way it reads as it doesn't matter, which is kind of funny. All right, the second argument to it is going to be another arrow function right here. And it's in the body of that arrow function that we write our assertions using, for example, the expect keyword. But we don't need to write any assertions right now. I just want to show you the Jest mock function functionality. So first up, what is a Jest mock function? Well, I want you to think about a mock rehearsal, which you might have heard about before when you think about something like a Broadway play, or maybe a dress rehearsal is another word you might hear for a mock rehearsal. It's basically when the actors get on stage and they walk through the entire performance, but not without a real-world audience in front of them. It's kind of like a basic run-through to make sure everything is functional and works correctly, but it's not the real performance just yet. That's what we call a mock rehearsal, right? So within the scope of JavaScript, what a mock function is effectively a function that is going to play the role of a real function. It's intended to be a replacement or a stand-in or a substitute for a real function or a real method. It's something that we are supposed to ideally swap in that can play the role of a real-world functionality or our real implementation functionality without having to have all of the complexity that is associated with that real-world functionality. So just to give you a more specific example, because I do understand that description can be a little bit confusing, when we are going to test our app component in the next lesson, we're going to need to find a way to deal with, for example, this logic right here. Here we are using the Axios get method in order to make a request to an API and get some data. There is a lot of complexity to how the get method inside the Axios library works, right? And not only that, it's other people's code, so we may not know all of its intricacies, right? And also it is directly connected to the idea of needing some kind of endpoint to hit in order to get data. In other words, our implementation right here that relies on Axios get is kind of complex. Wouldn't it be great if we can get a method that simulates what the get method does, that behaves just like the get method? It will have the same name, but it will have a different functionality. Rather than making an API request, instead, it can automatically, for example, return a promise that resolves to have an array of employee data. It's basically a replacement. It's a substitute. It's something that can stand in here and say, nope, instead of using the real thing, use me instead. Another analogy that I often cite is a stuntman within an action movie. Whenever you're shooting an action movie and there's some kind of risky stunt, you typically don't have the real actor perform that because that's dangerous and they're worth lots of millions of dollars. Instead, you have a stuntman that is called a stand-in, right? Because they stand in and they have the look and appearance of the original actor, but they're performing that specific stunt and they're the ones who are actually doing the job. It's the same functionality here where our mock function is like that stuntman. It's going to be the thing that steps in and plays the role of an original functionality, such as the get method, so that we don't have to worry about all of the complexity of the original implementation. That still can be a little bit confusing, but I promise it will make more sense once we see it in practice in the very next lesson. But for now, I just want to show you how we can create a manual Jest mock function and show you some of its basic functionalities. So right here, within our it function, we have access to a Jest keyword, and that is a global object that's going to be available to us simply because we are running Jest from the command line, and Jest will provide all of these global available functions, such as describe, such as it, and in this case, such as the Jest object. So on that object, we have a method called fn, that is short for function, and if we invoke that, we're going to get back a Jest mock function. So here we're creating a sample Jest mock function. I'm going to assign this to a constant called myMagicFunc. And so here we go. So for now, you can think of our Jest mock function as being a super simple and stupid function that does nothing. It's basically equivalent to creating an arrow function like this that does nothing. And you might have the question, well, why don't we use a plain arrow function here that does nothing? Why do we need a Jest mock function? And the answer is because the Jest mock function actually has a lot of extra functionality attached to it that can be super beneficial for us. For example, this Jest mock function right here, stored in the myMagicFunc constant, has the ability to track how many times it's been invoked. It has the ability to track with what arguments it's been invoked, right? So it has more power than just a basic JavaScript function. It's a function that is able to self-reflect, that is able to look at itself and see how it has been interacted with. How many times have I been called? What have I been called with? What are those arguments, etc. So there's more flexibility in how we can customize this function, and there's also more flexibility in how it's able to observe itself within the program. So I want to show you right here that if I take this myMagicFunc mock function, which you can just think of for now as a regular JavaScript function, if we invoke this right now, I want to show you that the default return value is going to be undefined. So right here, I'm going to run npm run test. That is going to run our test suite. And we're going to find all of the files in our project with a .test.js extension. Right now, that's only app, so we're running it. And you can see right here, that function is returning undefined by default. That is the standard behavior. Whenever we create a Jest mock function, it will return undefined by default. But the cool thing is we can actually customize this function to return whatever we want. So down here below, I will take my magic function, which is a function, and that is going to have a method on it called mockReturnValue. What this method allows us to do is to specify the return value that this mock function should return when we invoke it. So we don't have to worry about a real-world implementation. We can just specify what is going to be the return value whenever this function runs, right? Remember, at the end of the day, this is kind of a contrived example, but the ultimate purpose of this mock function is that it's going to replace a real-world function somewhere in our code. So whatever our real-world function returns, maybe after 20 lines of logic, we can simulate the same kind of behavior by simply specifying a mock return value here for our mock function without needing to worry about those 20 lines of complexity that are in the real implementation that this mock function will eventually replace. So for example, let's say I want to return the value 10. It's just an arbitrary value. If I save that and then console log myMagicFunc being invoked again, you can see down below that now we are going to return 10. And that will continue to be returned no matter how many times I run myMagicFunc. You can see each time it returned the value 10 because that is what we specified, right? So we have this kind of beautiful object that we can customize to do whatever we want for us. It's basically a function that we can tell to return whatever value we need. Here's another super cool functionality. I can also make my mock function behave like an asynchronous function. Remember, an asynchronous function in JavaScript is a function that returns a promise. And a promise is just an object in JavaScript that represents an operation that will take some amount of time that will eventually resolve to give you a value. So in our case, our Axios get method returns a promise, and that promise, when it resolves, will have the API's response, the actual data, the array of employee objects, right? And the reason it's a promise is because it's asynchronous, which means it's an operation that will take some amount of time. It can take half a second or 10 seconds, but eventually it will complete, and then it will give us that data that we need. That's the big difference between a regular return value versus a promise. A regular return value is returned instantaneously. A promise is an object that represents effectively a return value that will be returned in some amount of time that we can't predict in advance, right? So we can emulate or simulate that exact same behavior with Jest. So right here, I'm going to take my mock function, which is represented by my magic func, and rather than using the mock return value method right here, I want to show you another method called mock resolved value. What this is going to allow us to do is to specify a return value here of a promise that's going to resolve or provide the data that we provide right here. So let's say I put 20 right here. What this means is my magic func now, when invoked, is not just going to return the value 20, but rather it's going to return a promise that resolves to have the value 20. So right here, what I can do is show you that if I console log simply the invocation of my magic func, right here you can see we're getting a promise with the value 20, but of course the way we typically work with promises within JavaScript is we use the async await syntax to tell JavaScript to block execution until that promise resolves. So right here we can simulate that functionality by right here making our test function async, which allows us to use the await keyword in front of something here that returns a promise. My magic func will now return a promise thanks to our setup on line number 9. So right here, I can use the await keyword. And now you can see we are getting the value in our console log. So this is simulating an asynchronous operation. This is something that could very well replace our API call. Of course, rather than returning 20, we have to have a promise that resolves to return an array of employee objects, but we now have the functionality of an asynchronous operation without having to worry about really complex implementation details. We just have this mock function that is a stand-in, that is a substitute that can play the role. It can return whatever value we want to us, and it can play the role of being an asynchronous operation that gives us some data. So the only part that kind of remains is to take this logic and replace Axios.get with a mock function just like this one. And it will be able to simulate an API call without having to actually worry about making a real API call and using the actual functionality of Axios.get, which is a totally separate library from us, right? It's not our code, it's somebody else's code, right? So this is a basic introduction to Jest mock functions. In the very next lesson, I want to show you how a mock function is able to track its invocations and the arguments that it's been invoked with. And then after we finish that up, I'll show you how we can use all this knowledge to write our first test for the app component. So I will see you in the next lesson.